This is Amiable Arguments.
Hello everyone and welcome back to Amiable Arguments with me, Luca. I'd just like to start by giving you some new news, and here it is. I promised you all at the very at the very end of last year that I would branch out and not have it so restrictive, because I realise that YouTube isn't the most practical platform to have a podcast on, so I'm now on Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and a bunch of other platforms that I'll leave in the description down below, and I'll also put it on my Instagram page, so it should all be a little bit easier to find. Anyway, now that that's all out of the way, I'm very excited to be with a new guest here today, a northerner after my own heart as well, and so Patrick, thank you for being on here today.
Thank you for having me. It's an absolute pleasure.
Fantastic. So, Patrick, I came across you and your work and the work of your group organisation, Local Matters, on Instagram. So, without me putting words into your mouth, what can you tell us a little bit about it and what you're trying to do with it?
Absolutely, yeah. So, Local Matters was founded sort of the back end of 2019, start of 2020, and it is a metapolitical organisation centred around the ideas of localism. So by metapolitical, that is, in layman's terms, largely focused around activism, but essentially the aim of the group is to push political change by changing public discourse, shifting the Overton window, rather than traditional means of party politics or something similar to that.
Yes, which is quite. It feels a lot like what I'm trying to do as well. It's not some advocate group for a particular party, but it's just to get people talking, get them thinking, and get them. So, what are some particular topics that you feel that the Overton window, that what the public discourse is, that it needs to branch out and consider more? What are some of the big things that are driving?
Yeah, so this? I think there's a lot that's really restrictive in terms of discourse, and there's a lot that needs to be considered outside of the norm. We live in a system which is very good at acting as if it's not a political system, if that makes sense. We think of much as the status quo, and thinking about things other than the way things are is very alien to us. It was Mark Fisher who said it's hard to think of a world, outside of this modern capital liberal world, than to imagine a world of anything else. So it's in terms of specifics, talking about things such as political reform is massive for us. So voter reform is one. So we had a vote a long time ago in the UK, the AV referendum, and that was to change from the first past the post system. But there was so much misinformation in that referendum and a monopoly on the discussion by major political parties that it wasn't able to get anywhere.
Because it was in their self-interest to carry on the first past the post, yes.
Absolutely. And then we have, as well, things such as political structure, which is so embedded into the United Kingdom in terms of this unitary state structure from the ground up. To challenge that and to offer an alternative, something we talk about is British federalism, confederalism, creating a United Kingdom rather than having power centralised in London, being decentralised, similar to something like Switzerland with its canton system or the United States. These sort of radical reforms are things that don't really have a platform yet and need to be brought into the line of discussion.
That's fascinating, because one, it's I'd like to start by saying that everything you've just sort of said there feels like it feels new, it feels exciting, because it's not actually the sort of idea you hear out on the street. And you can certainly see, you can probably detect from my accent, I'm very much northerner like yourself. And I know the dissatisfaction that people feel up there with when they don't feel represented. And I would certainly, for my own personal preferences, I'm very much in favour of bigger decisions happening closer to home. And the closer those decisions happen to where we are, the better that would probably be for the local community. Do you think that this is purely to play devil's advocate, but obviously if the advocacy is for proportional representation as opposed to first past the post, Do you accept the criticism that proportional representation often leads to just weak government with a very sort of
Um,
equal footing of every voice and nothing ever gets done? Or do you reject that out of hand?
I think it's a very fair criticism applied to many states that already use proportional representation. If you look at many European countries, that's often the case. The thing is that you can't look at any localist policy, or you really shouldn't look at any localist policy in a vacuum. We have things such as subsidiarity, which would absolutely change the way in which proportional representation forms a government. Because rather than just being a singular government of diverse parties that can't agree on anything, you tend to find that regions and localities are far more, at least generally speaking, far more unified in terms of their political leanings. So when you start to handle government at more decentralized set stages and levels, it becomes less of an issue in terms of having one big government that can agree on everything, because it's not about that one big government doing everything. That the actual national level of government is actually not anymore the most important one in people's day-to-day lives.
You can see this, can't you, as well, though, just how, even though we live in one United Kingdom, how stark the political differences have been and certainly are getting. Particularly, I think the case of England and Scotland comes to mind. I mean, Scotland's idea of what a society should look like in the general consensus of the Scottish people is so far removed from what the English want society to be. And at that point, it's sort of a case of, well, what right does one have to tyrannise the other simply by the fact that it has more seats?
Absolutely.
And so what would you do? Would you further it to Yorkshire having a devolved parliament and Cornwall having a devolved parliament? Or how would you go about it?
Absolutely. I mean, I talk to a lot of Scottish people, I have a lot of Scottish friends, and the level of disconnect they feel from the Westminster government is completely understandable, and it's something that I share in. I feel like, just as much as the Scottish people don't want to be ruled over by, a government that's all the way down in London, 650 MPs trying to represent 66 million people isn't going to work. So absolutely, we want to see proper devolution, not sort of one foot in the door devolution that we've seen currently, but a full federal or confederal model within the UK to give out equal political power to everybody. So there is no top-down leadership in the UK anymore, and every region, state, county, constituency is able to much more accurately portray the way that they want to live, the way that they want their constituency to look like. Everything from taxes to transport, what have you, to be governed by the people who are going to be, using those services and living in that area.
And then at what point does all of this devolution come to the point that just there's no longer any sort of ties between those now different devolved governments? Do we still consider ourselves English, or do we go to considering ourselves Yorkshire or Merseyside or whatever it may be?
I think identity is a really important point, and it's something that we talk a lot about in terms of our manifesto, where these historic regional identities are massive factors in terms of what makes us in our given regions. It's a massive part of who we are. I'm very proudly a Yorkshireman. That being said, I'm also very proudly an Englishman. In the same way, I'm very proud to say I'm British.
Yes.
I think these identities are layered just in the way that we could say, we love our family, we love our town, we love our community. These things, we believe in subsidiarity, right? It's just as important to have pride for your constituency, for your region, as it is to have pride in your nation. We talk a lot about a renaissance of regional and local identities, and building on those is massively important. And also will come alongside with building local and regional democracy, because as people feel more connected to their region, they'll want to have more of a say in terms of what goes on in it.
This is to bring it back to obviously what's happening in our own. As we sit here now, obviously with the government currently going on about the whole, it's a big pioneering platform, isn't it? Leveling up, leveling up the north,
Yes.
getting everything, but. Really, from my point of view, I might be totally misunderstanding it. It feels an awful like Westminster, just deciding that it's going to chuck money at places where it thinks it matters, rather than putting that money into the hands of the local communities for them to decide that for themselves. It's very, there's an elitism to it. It's we know best down here still. It still has, if you agree with that.
No, absolutely. I think it's treated as a charity project,
Mm.
by the South and by many MPs. I know people like Rishi Sunak have talked about the North having to accept lower wages and essentially understanding its place. We're often treated as second class, and it's understandable that when so much power is centralized in the hands of elites and the hands of people who've all gone to Eton and come from these similar political circles, that these attitudes are going to continue to brew and manifest. I mean, if you look at just even in things such as international aid, it's always said that money is best handled when given to more localized, regionalized communities rather than to a state level. And that exists within the state as well, rather than trying to impose things from the top down and the government being overbearing. Being able to do things within communities on a regional basis wouldn't only be more fair, but it would also be far more efficient than the current system we have already.
Because I suppose it is as well that um, I don't know if this is fair to say, but for an innately for an organisation that you have this local matters, it seems it obviously is very invested in politics. And one of the things that I personally felt from reading the Instagram was that it is actually quite apolitical, ironically at the same time, because you're not saying we're in favour of low taxes or big government. You're saying it's not for us to decide that level. It's for the local communities to decide if they want big government or low taxes or trade tariffs or any of those sorts of things. So you're actually being political without having a left or right sort of dichotomy in there, which I can imagine is very appealing to people you come across.
Absolutely, it's something that I, in particular, am very sort of prideful of in terms of the way we handle the social media presence and the internals of the organisation. We have a wide variety of opinions and views within the movement, and we promote that, we encourage that, because ultimately it doesn't matter, what your views are, they deserve to be heard. Even if I don't agree with you, I respect your right to say it, and I think that currently nobody's voice is being heard. So it's a massive part of localism to try and respect that, to try and interpret that. And as well, like you say, it's massively appealing to the public as well, when they don't have to sit there and agree with my transport policy to get on board with the broader ideas. I've worked with a party called the Yorkshire Party previously, and one of my biggest grievances with them was the fact that they had this brilliant policy to have a devolved Yorkshire Parliament, a Yorkshire Assembly, and that would truly offer a real form of devolution into Yorkshire. The downside was they didn't talk about it half the time. They ended up talking about transport policies and taxation. And I think, before we can start talking about these specifics, and I'm sure, everybody within local matters has very strong opinions on all of these issues. It's important that we actually get a say first before we start talking about, what we do after we get there.
Fantastic. One of the things that really caught my eye, I'll obviously leave a link to your Instagram page so that people listening to this can go and follow it, and I strongly recommend you do, because we've got some great content on there. But one of the posts that I was really drawn to, you had this fabulous piece of artwork that was two people sat on either side of a bus, and one of them was looking, I think it was one of them was looking out the window. You know what, you're nodding away.
Yeah.
And one of them was the Costa Coffee on the one side, and it was all very sterile and corporate. And then you had on the other side this beautiful, just local business, and you had pictures on the walls framed of its legacy and heritage and all these sorts of things. And it was just this fantastic campaign for buying local and putting small businesses ahead of the big corporations that are just buying up not just England, but obviously so many parts of the world as well. And that really resonated with me. I thought that was a really, really astute point.
It's one of the big bits of glue that sticks all the ideas together, this idea of shopping local. When we're trying to get people to relate to their local communities, thinking about their local businesses, their small shops. These are things that people remember and things that people value. One thing that Local Matters is sort of alien in is trying to tie all these different issues together. There's plenty of people talking about democratic reform and various other issues like environmentalism, but binding them all together is something which Local Matters is very alone in doing. And talking about shopping local and bringing things down to these relatable levels, which everybody, even down to your grandma, will have some sort of opinion and passion about, is absolutely brilliant. We've had a lot of success with that. We've done a lot of street level activism as well in terms of supporting that. I remember back at the start of the pandemic, one of the first actions we did was going out and trying to encourage people to support local businesses, as a lot of them had shut down. I think it was a few million had shut down because of lockdowns and were threatened to shut down. So it's always been one of the things that we've had great public reception from, and something that's always really fun and engaging to talk about, because nobody can really argue against it, right? It's one of those brilliant points.
No, please continue.
No, it's one of those brilliant points where it's so holistic, right? It's so endearing to sit there and think about your own community in that sort of way. Even if people like the low prices of something like a supermarket, everyone still has that idealistic idea in their head of, going down to the high street and shopping in these local stores. And we hope to make that possible again.
And everyone's on first name bases with one another.
Absolutely.
You've got, I mean, I've lived a lot of my life in a local village up north as well, so I really get that sense of localism and that community feel, and which isn't to say that, of course, everywhere would want to live like a village, but some people are natural city dwellers, and that's fine. And so tell me about tell me about some of the reactions that you've had on the street, and where chiefly you have been campaigning, where you've managed to spread yourselves a bit.
Yeah, so in terms of reactions, we've had an absolutely brilliant reaction from the public every time we go out to do anything. We have sort of two different channels of action. So we'll talk about things such as voter reform and democracy, and these are often really new ideas that people aren't often familiar with or haven't really interacted much with. And we often bring these to protests all across the country. So we've been to London, Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds. I think we've been to Kent as well for one of those.
I'm sorry.
And so it's we've always had a really great reception there, because a lot of these protests as well are really hyper focused on issues. They want to complain about the policing bill that was hoping to cut down on protests. They're campaigning against the government doing X, Y, and Z, and we're the only ones there offering solutions rather than just complaining. And people absolutely love that, because there's so much energy and so much political tension in the UK right now. People want to channel it somewhere, and that's why you're seeing all these big marches and events on the streets for every single conceivable issue. So we've had great success in terms of those platforms, and then, as you said, we've had a lot of success in terms of these more recognisable community spirit based actions, talking about shopping local. We did a more intense, I suppose you could call it, action in Manchester, where we dropped a large banner inside a shopping centre criticising Primark for its use of child slavery, poor conditions in factories, and encouraged people to shop local. That. Oh, well, the staff weren't too fond, but we had a great public reception when we were there, and reception on social media is fantastic as well all the time. But we have such great reception from both. And what surprised me the most is older people I always assumed would get it, because there's always that idea of, a lack of community spirit being something that's missed. But I think also what surprised me is, because I'd always felt this way, but I sort of didn't project it onto everybody else, is that younger people themselves are absolutely desperate for that feeling of community spirit and sense of belonging. A lot of people feel as if they're floating, and when you can offer them that sense of roots, they'll cling to it. So responses from younger people, university students, that sort of age, has been absolutely brilliant as well, and something that's really encouraging to see, because those are the sort of ages we want to get people involved with, out on the streets doing activism as well alongside us.
This is okay, great. There's so your whole idea of devolution would Does Westminster have any? Because obviously federalism, even in the sense of America, it has to have some sort of final decision, or at least something decided on the federal level. So, what would Westminster be in charge of? What would its place in England be?
So we focus on a policy of subsidiarity, right, which is anything that can be done locally or regionally should be done so. Make things as local as possible. Uh, as you say, there's things that need to come down to a final say, and there's things that are beyond, the county of Cornwall to decide. So things like that are international relations, trade deals,
Defense,
the
I imagine.
military,
Yeah.
defense, yeah. Some sort of integrated energy policy would be decided in between regions. All these different issues to connect different constituencies as well would be done at that national level. It's more turning the halls of Westminster into the brain of the body rather than the whole body itself, if that makes sense. It can coordinate individual movements in between regions, counties, constituencies, and then also speak out into the world rather than having to go down and into the very sort of tidy minutiae and handle every single issue itself. It can help, these smaller constituencies coordinate.
How do you practically think that some of the things that you're working towards can be achieved? Because I think that we have a real problem in this country with the it is basically a two-party system in all but name. And obviously, I think, the Brexit referendum, I thought at the time, well, that's basically seeing the death of the Labour Party. And then I sort of thought that after everything with COVID and Partygate and all these sorts of things, I thought, well, maybe this is going to be the death of the Tories too. But if the polling is anything to go by, people have basically just gone straight back to thinking, oh, well, the Tories have let us down, let's go back to Labour. And it's like, wait, no, what? Where are you going? Just let them go. Let them both go, just find some, whether it be the Green Party, the Liberal Dems, Reform UK, just find someone else, out there to, but we can't seem to do it. We can't seem to just quite as a nation let the two parties go and realise that they've both become rotten to the core. Do you have any solutions for that, or?
Yeah, so the Lib Lab Con tyranny is something that devastates us as much as it sounds like it does you. It massively is entrenched in not just British political thought, but also in British political systems, right? First past the post makes anything other than a two-party system, a wishful thinking, let's say. However, there are examples of people successfully shaking off this sort of tyranny from the Labour Party and the Tory Party. A great example is the town of Frome, which I believe is I think it might be in Hampshire or Dorset. It's around sort of the southwest anyway. Okay. And it's a small constituency which had essentially had it up to here with its local councillors not doing anything. It was, party politicians signing the box and not really making any difference for the sake of the town. I think one of the things that inspired them was they came to a meeting and asked their local Labour councillor what their environmental policy was, and they said the park. So they decided to get together, and as a collection of citizens and independents, they started a party called Independents for Frome, and they rejected the two-party system and ran in their local elections, and within 2 elections, they'd managed to take a strong hold from the Labour Party into a fully independent council.
Wow.
And now, since they've done that, I think it's 17 councillors they have now, all under that banner. All of the parties have stopped running because they've done such a great job. People within the community have been massively engaged with local politics. They've started to host meetings where people can go and discuss issues, and they're packed. You can see pictures and videos of these halls full of people voicing their concerns, discussing issues.
I'll have to look into this. It sounds incredible.
there's a brilliant book called Flat Pack Democracy 2.0, which talks all about the process of how they got it started and where it went. But it not only shows that it is possible, but it also shows that when it's done, it has such a brilliant effect in terms of galvanizing local people. And the actual constituents repeatedly talked about how good of a job the party was doing in terms of improving the lives of the people in the area. You know, when you stop thinking about things in terms of, you know, a game of political chess, how many councillors can we get? How many MPs can we get? Is that a majority? Is that not a majority? And actually start thinking, what can I do for my constituents? The game changes quite quickly. One final point as well in terms of this sort of issue between the two-party system. A lot of the issue comes down to as well a lack of viable alternative, right? You know, you talk about the Greens, Reform UK, Monster Raving Loony Party seems the most sensible at this point, I'm quite sure. The issue is that people don't really know which ship to jump to. And that's why Local Matter doesn't pose itself as a political party, because we understand that not only is it very difficult to work within the existing political system, but even if we were able to do that, people just aren't ready for it yet. The ideas haven't been built up. People aren't aware of these sorts of policies and this kind of thinking. That's what groundwork we're doing first. And then we hope localist policy, localist politicians, localist organizations and groups in all different areas will start to spring up as a result of that. And we have seen that already. We've seen different groups and different organizations and different individuals start to talk about localism far more frequently than it might have been a few years ago. And of course, we can't take all credit for that. But there is a massive push in that direction. And until that groundwork is laid, I think anything before that's too early in terms of trying to achieve any serious political change.
How would you expect, given that everything were to happen at such a... I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm, you know, in full transparency, I'm a pretty small government guy, but how do you expect, when everything's done at such a federalist level, England as a whole to have any sort of firm unifying voice on a national stage? How, when everything is done at such a minute level... I know we talked about, you know, the fact that the government were being charged trade deals and defence and all those sorts of things, but where is its unifying voice on the national stage? What if we were to implement the things that you suggest?
I think if we're talking about a unifying voice, I wouldn't argue that needs to be political. I think falling into that trap is something that many states which have seemed to break away from sort of the traps of modern liberal capitalism have fallen into. I mean, if you look at, you know, the Soviet Union, for example, they centralized all authority to the state to create a singular voice on behalf of the workers, right? And that was absolutely devastating in terms of the individual liberties of local peoples and what have you. So instead, what we talk about is not just cooperation between these regions to form, you know, actual physical political movement, but also on a cultural and spiritual level to emphasize this idea of regional identity, regional solidarity, English identity, English solidarity, British identity, British solidarity. I think we can create it from the bottom up rather from the top down. I don't think we need, you know, big government at the top telling us and keeping us together. I think we can do that in a far more cooperative fashion by coming together as a collection of equal regions, shared in identity, history, culture, etc. And this is the way that, you know, many states have ran for much of history, and it's the way that, if you look back to, you know, England's early history, it's the way that England was ran before the nation state in terms of these independent lords and what have you, cooperating to form the idea of a whole England.
Yeah, Mercia, Wessex, Northumbria, and yeah, no, it's a pretty legit answer. I'll take it. Okay, great. Then what I think the question that I want to ask next is really how do you have like a plan, like a 10-year plan, like how long do you guys have any sort of idea how long you think it might take for you to start seeing the change that you really want to in a big sense?
Absolutely not.
Okay, great. That's
We
fair.
feel like anything to
That's
that
fair.
end would
That's
set us up for
totally fair.
disappointment.
Yeah. No.
Uh,
I suppose that's pretty wise. Yeah.
the politics is quite often a spectator sport.
Mm.
We have to be very reactionary to what's happening in the news and current affairs. We do think that the tides are turning. We do think that localism on the rise is on the rise. Sorry, in both talking circles and in public sentiment. However, predicting when which domino is going to fall is very, very difficult. That being said, we of course talk internally about actions and what the organisation is going to be doing. But much of what we do is on not as much a day to day in terms of not planning ahead, but it's more so we just want to continue growing the ideas, the brand, the movement, and then hopefully when a situation arises in which localism is more feasible to be implemented, or there's any sort of political climate that more readily welcomes the ideas, we're ready to pounce on it. There's far too many people who want to wait for the right situation to do anything, as opposed to actually building up beforehand so they're ready for it.
Yes. Waiting for a window, waiting for the perfect circumstance, which is never going to come because we never live in a world of perfect circumstances.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's like I think as C.S. Lewis at the start of World War II said something like, "These are suboptimal conditions." But
it's a way of framing it, yeah.
But it's like, well, when are they ever going to be perfect? When are they ever going to be optimal? So let's talk more on your own personal level then, Patrick. So you're a Yorkshire lad. I assume you've done quite a lot of campaigning in Yorkshire. Because I've been to Yorkshire many, many times. I'm just from across the border, but it's when you get out of Sheffield and Bradford and you start getting into the valleys and everything, just these tiny little villages in the middle of nowhere and everything. Where do they fit into all of this then? Do they just become subsumed? If you start doing everything on a regional level, then doesn't that just create some level of tyranny over the smaller parts of that society, where all the villages are basically just drowned out by whatever the voices of the cities are? Is that, if you understand what I'm driving at, is that a danger?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I actually come from a small, previously mining village in Yorkshire. So this is an issue very close to home for me. And it comes back to that idea of subsidiarity, right? Even within this regionalized system, these things provide a framework for an overall federal structure to take place. That being said, that doesn't mean we're not going to have lower levels underneath that. We're not going to, abolish parish councils. We're not going to try to strip away the powers of communities. In fact, things like community assemblies, village hall meetings, these sort of very tiny, seemingly insignificant, political structures are things which we actually want to empower, because we feel that, within one's own community is where, your own political interest should lie the most in terms of improving a lot of yourself, your neighbours. We start off our book by saying that localists believe that the community is the most important political and economic entity. And, your community is your village, it is your town, and it is your city as well. And giving the proper ability for these regions, for these towns, these communities to be able to determine how they want to live their lives is massively important. Because otherwise, like you say, we're repeating the same steps and having that same unitary level, just a little bit smaller.
Yes, no, totally. And the only other thing I'd say as well is that you talk about the importance of these places to preserve their own feeling of community, to preserve the feeling of Englishness. And although I have to say, under your system, although I'm not going to kid you, I personally think that the Union is going to break apart. I see no way that... I think we're buying time at best before Scotland leaves it. And I think that Scotland has a right to leave. I don't think we have the right to every nation, which Scotland is, has a right to self-determination. I thoroughly believe that. But but when you look at what Tony Blair did with the devolved parliaments of Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, most of them have just become hotbeds for separatism. So all I'm, which isn't to say, but sorry, I'm asking this in a very, very convoluted way. But what implicit in the way that you lay it out is the idea that these places will naturally identify as English, will naturally identify as British, and all these sorts of things. But if there's anything that the Brexit referendum should have taught us, it's that actually there are vast swathes of Britain where that actually isn't the feeling. They would rather feel European, or they don't feel like local people, particularly in the cities. They feel like part of a larger international conglomerate. So, if we were to take that idea, then what would stop just parts of England just fracturing off because they feel more affinity with Brussels or America or wherever it may be?
So I'll sort of break this down into two parts.
Sure.
In terms of talking about Scotland and the broader union, I personally completely agree with you. I don't think the union is long for this world. I personally am strongly in favour of a confederal model. I think that federalism or confederalism could save the union. I think it's the only way that we could have political unity between, and should have political unity between, Britain, Scotland, Wales, England, etc. But I think that, like you say, it is inevitable and it is their right to break away. That being said, I don't think that devolution itself is necessarily to blame in concept. I think it's devolution in practice. By that I mean devolution has always been offered as a placament of separatist sentiment, and it's always been offered as a means by which to reduce the desire of Scottish peoples, of Welsh peoples, to desire total autonomy in the form of independence. It never creates true political autonomy. It essentially just creates a sub-government within the overarching, Westminster unitary state still. There is still that overarching level in London which is ruling over Scotland. The key difference between what we're trying to do in that is that we don't want to keep that unitary state in place, right? We want to offer all regions and nations political equality. So there would be no, Westminster government telling Scotland from the top down how to do anything in terms of what happens in Scotland, because that would all be decided within Scotland's own regions, parliaments, and constituencies. So that political equality doesn't, I feel, breed separatism in the same way. I mean, you can look at very distinct, diverse nations such as Switzerland, which have very localized, regionalized systems of direct governance in their canton system. And I mean, that's a state where they speak separate languages in some regions. So if they're able to keep that state together via a system such as that, I have confidence that we could do the same here in the UK as well.
Fair enough. And obviously,
on your second point, in terms of, sorry, what was that?
No. Please carry on.
I was just going to say, in terms of your secondary point regarding this cosmopolitan sentiment within cities, I think that comes from a lack of identity and a lack of sense of belonging to any given community. People want that sense of belonging, and if they can't find it in England, if they can't find it in Yorkshire, they'll find it in Brussels. And it's a natural thing for people to want that sense of belonging, and they've lost it because not only is our own identity not as strong as it used to be, large in part due to Americanization, large in part due to differing political practices causing divisions, even down to community cohesion caused by immigration. Right, all these different points separate communities out and stop them feeling as interconnected to the rest of the country and the nation as they might want to be.
Totally agree.
This is something that we massively need to work on. It's something that's massively upsetting to see when English communities no longer feel English. It's at the root of why this cultural metapolitical approach needs to happen, because people need to veer away from that before they can accept and understand these localist ideas. And I think that is the battleground of the 21st century. I don't think we live in an era of left and right anymore. I think we do live in a battle of big versus small, of the cosmopolitan versus the local. And that's not to say that people need to abandon city life and all move out into the Cotswolds and start farming or live in a little cobbled street village. No, absolutely, cities are still going to be there, and cities are massively important. But we can't have them, be so abstract from the rest of the country that they start to feel as if they're different entities altogether. It's about bringing out a new culture and a new way of cooperation between all types of communities within Britain.
It does feel a lot like the cities want to just sort of drag the little folk, as it were, kicking and screaming into what they think is progress, and those small isolated places be damned. Like they stand in the way of the grand vision of what they think a society should be, rather than putting the choice in the hands of those local people to decide that for themselves. I think that you brought up the immigration point, and I think it's a pertinent one, because it was never actually put to a vote, and people were never asked about it, and yet it has undoubtedly had an enormous impact on the conversations we now have in the country, and the cohesion of the country, and all those sorts of things. So for no one to have even been asked, and it just to have been forced on the people of Bradford or Devon or Leicester or wherever it may be, or London, is obviously we can't just ignore conversations forever, because as soon as you start ignoring those things and pushing it, as you said right at the start, bringing it back to the Overton window, once you've decided that there are certain conversations that are outside of the Overton window, then that's obviously what leads to radicalism and desperation. So it's
absolutely. Yeah, no, it's something that I find quite upsetting in terms of the limitation of discourse. Immigration, in particular, is a massively hot topic, and it's something that we generally try to avoid talking about. Not because it's not something that we don't think is a factor, but ultimately because it's often not worth the the lashback you get whenever you do. Ultimately, I'm not particularly bothered what any individual's immigration stance is, but I do think it's a massive issue, as you said, that there has been no opportunity for the British people, for the English people, to have some sort of say on this. And I think consistently, in every election, when people are polled, immigration is absolutely one of the most massive things that's brought up, and time again, it's completely ignored. And I think that comes down to corporate interests. I think it comes down to 1,000 different factors. But it's absolutely not in the interests of the people as they see it. And ultimately, I think any community should have the right to decide, who they do and do not want to be a part of it. If you don't want a new housing development because there are 300,000 gross migrants coming into the country every year, you don't really have a say in it at the minute. But urbanization, all these other issues are at the heart of that. But to discuss these topics without being labelled as xenophobic or what have you is very, very difficult. It's not as if we want to create these closed off little villages that no one can come in and out of. But at the same time, there needs to be some sort of voice and some sort of platform to understand a reasonable level and to give people the option and the choice of, when to say enough is enough.
Obviously, you from your platform and from a lot of the things that you post on Instagram, it sounds like you're very much against the. It's not a phrase I understand, I admit, with a great deal of accuracy, but the neoliberalism and these huge corporations just planting the way into our lives, and you look around and you just see the death of small business, particularly with lockdown, which just wiped out all these small businesses and gave more and more money to Amazon and Google and all these sorts of things. So when things are done on a more local level, how does that, in your own words, help protect them more from corporate interests?
So, in terms of more overarching economic policy, these aren't things that can always be handled on an entirely local level. So, we can't, just reduce it to individual towns' high streets, right? We have to talk about overarching policies in terms of what do we want Britain's high streets to look like? How do we want Britain to shop? And ultimately, it comes down to insular economies, contained economies are better for the people who live in them, in the long term at the very least. When you start looking at statistics surrounding buying local, shopping within localities, economically speaking, it pumps so much money back into local economies. It baffles me that we don't, try and emphasize it more already. But there is that constant political pressure because we live in a liberal system to try and, maximize profits that importing from, the global south, East Asia, Africa is far more efficient for corporations. So it's actually when people understand that by shopping local, they're improving long term the wealth of their community. They're not going to want to see these corporations, in their communities anymore because they can see it as economically disadvantageous. And when you start offering political power to these communities to make that decision, that's when it starts being implemented into policy. So we talk a lot about cooperatives. We talk a lot about, giving power to communities to decide not just what businesses can and can't be operating within their community, but also how these businesses operate, how it looks like, and ultimately trying to, rather than be a state ruled by economics, be, communities ruling over their own economics and offering that power back to the people. I'm of the belief personally that we live in a very well-off country. We're all, at least, far more affluent than many other parts of the world, even at the most low level. And I think this constant desire and yearning for economic growth, as enforced by the state, as enforced by the very nature of liberal capitalism, is counterproductive to all communities involved. So trying to come towards a more sustainable conclusion and coming towards a more communitarian conclusion is one that I think communities will naturally reach when offered the power to do so themselves and offered the information in terms of the realities of the inequality in terms of the benefit of this international system of global trade, because ultimately we're not benefiting. The factory workers in the global south aren't benefiting. It is business owners, the 1%, etc., who are benefiting at the expense of everybody else.
Yes, we are propagating, we're perpetuating their suffering and their exploitation because we're so interested in buying cheap. Because,
Yes.
as you say, yeah. Excellent. Well, Patrick, we've probably got about 5 minutes left. So if there's anything that you don't feel that I've covered or anything that you'd in particular like to say to those listening, do you have anything you'd like to really get across about what you do that you feel I might have missed?
Yeah, so I'll just talk a little bit more about Local Matters as an organisation, what we do on a day-to-day.
Fantastic.
So essentially, Local Matters, as I've said, is a multi-political organisation, and we're active all across the internet. We have our own website, thelocalist.org. We're active on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Telegram as well. You can follow us on there. And if you're wanting to get involved in anything that we do, see what we're up to, just reach out to us on any platform. We are always interested in welcoming on new activists, new designers, new writers, video editors. Any skill that you can bring to the table is massively important. And even if you don't have any skills, absolutely there's something that you can get involved in, or at the very least, we'd be more than happy to have you involved in the discussion. We have a public supporters chat that anyone can join in and discuss these ideas, disagree or agree, debate us or bow down to us, whatever you like. There's absolutely any platform for whatever you want to do in terms of the movement. We are encouraging people to support us in any way they see fit. We also are on Patreon, PayPal. You can support us on there financially as well. But yeah, that's about everything really. I mean, I would, like I say, encourage people to go take a look, get involved. But I just want to say again, thank you for having me on here. It's been a brilliant chat.
Well, no, thank you for coming on, Patrick. It's been really enlightening. Like I say, I feel like you're one of the things that drew me to just wanting to have you guys on wasn't anything to do with how much I agreed or disagreed with what you had to say. I think it's just really the fact that I feel like you guys have got a real unique voice right now, and the things that you're advocating for aren't really things that I feel like I heard being discussed an awful lot. So I wanted to have you on to hear those ideas and test it all out. So thank you so much for joining me. Once again, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, I have, as I told you at the beginning, branched out to multiple different platforms now. So I will leave those in the description down below, which I'll do on YouTube. I don't quite know how the rest of them work yet, but I'll get there. I was basically born yesterday when it comes to modern technology. So thank you again for all listening. I'll try and have another podcast out very, very soon. And I wish you all a very good day. So thank you very much. Arrivederci.